Hello and welcome to the third program in the series Trees, the Silent Sentinels. I'm Sherwood McCaskie. As always, I'm glad that you have chosen to spend the next 30 minutes with my guest. In last week's program, the majestic mahogany tree was exhibited, somewhat of a status symbol here in Barbados. We looked at the beautiful canopied area known as Cherry Tree Hill, and we lamented the destruction of the mahogany trees that once lined Maxwell Main Road. This week, we turn our attention to a tree that is of great significance to many around the world. In fact, convinced that it possesses supernatural powers, many people behave circumspectly around the silk cotton tree.
One important tree that touched the spirit world of the pre-Columbian people, not only in the islands but going way into Central America, up into the Mayan lands in Yucatan, in what is today Mexico and Guatemala and Belize, was what we call here today in the English islands the silk cotton tree. And this silk cotton tree is majestic, particularly the older samples that we see. And for the Taino people up in the Greater Antilles and those people who inhabited these islands here in the Eastern Caribbean, the tree became a symbol of their cosmos. We look at the tree and we see these long, firm branches that extend in the middle part of the tree, and then the canopy that develops from the branches higher up. And what they basically symbolized to them was that these lower branches, these bigger lower branches, was the earth on which they lived. This is where they had their houses, their fields. This is the land into which they were born. And every day the sun would come up from the east. In their vision, of course, it was the earth that was moving, but in their vision it was the sun that would come up over the canopy of the tree, set in the afternoon and go through the underworld below, and then rise up again the following morning. And so too with life itself. You live your life on the land where you were born. You come out of your mother's fetus folded up, and you enter into the world. You live your life, and then in the Amerindian Caribbean, what happened on death was that your body was folded up again as a fetus. You were put in a hammock to simulate the placenta around you. And then you were buried in a womb-like tomb, and you went down the trunk of this mythical tree into the underworld. And one day you would come back out again. So the silk cotton tree was this great symbol of the cosmos of these people.
What an interesting analogy. It has always been told that the Amerindians were in harmony with their environment. It is no surprise to learn that this tree was revered by this group of people. The trees were considered sacred dwelling places of spirits and held similar significance in African-derived popular culture.
And so the silk cotton tree became this spiritual center, this spirit tree. And today in Haiti still, the silk cotton tree, particularly the larger ones with these huge buttress roots, are used as shrines for ceremonies and religious memory. And so here we have a tree, the silk cotton, some of which of its spiritual uses have still come down to us today. But in that Amerindian world, many of the trees had certain qualities that would benefit the souls and the spirits of those ancient people. And it linked on into the colonial period when the West Africans came across and adapted the use and their concept of the silk cotton tree from what they had known in the various tribal groups in West Africa.
And that adaptation continued for many years after the 1600s. This is the legendary silk cotton tree, easily among the most recognized, feared and notorious symbols of the spirit world in the West Indies. Its perimeter remains a sacred feature on the landscape of Barbados. My colleague, Carla Daniel, a researcher, brought us right here to the east of the island, where two of those silk cotton trees are to be found.
We are here in the St. Philip Parish Church graveyard, where there are two of the largest and possibly oldest silk cotton trees which remain on the island of Barbados today. These have some of the widest and largest spreading canopies, and that's primarily because there's very little competition to be found here among the graves. The silk cotton tree has been revered in many cultures, typically in Western Africa and Central America. The tree is considered by many cultures to be that world tree, that sacred tree of life from which all creation resulted. And looking at the tree, looking at that splendid trunk and those magnificent large branches as they reach towards the heavens, you can clearly see why. Moving away from the religious aspect of the tree gets its name, the silk cotton, due to the silky fibers which are produced when it is in fruit. So you get the pod being formed, and then you have these tiny little black seeds that are completely surrounded by a tuft of silk. And once the pod falls off, the dry husk falls down, and that ball of silk is exposed, it's dispersed by the wind, and the seeds are taken far and wide.
And that is a beautiful process that should be observed by all of us. In fact, as we now learn from Senator Professor Sir Henry Fraser, there is a period when you may observe the various phases of this tree.
The silk cotton tree goes through 6 phases of the leaves turning yellow at Christmas, then falling, and then the buds appearing with the blossoms, and then the blossoms opening. And the tree is covered with blossoms and sparrows. The sparrows love the silk cotton blossom. So all these white blossoms appear, the sparrow birds descend upon them, and the sparrow birds convert it into a purple substance. So the sparrow birds then leave a purple trail behind them. And then the flowers fall off, and then you see the little fruit appear. And they get bigger and bigger, and they produce something about 3 to 5 inches long, a rather tapered fruit pod, and that then opens up to produce a ball of cotton this size. And you can best see this either at the back of the garrison, behind the grandstand at the garrison, where the 2 silk cotton trees, or to go to Cotterton College, where the silk cotton trees are magnificent. 2 huge trees by the ornamental lake, fed by the Cotterton Spring, and you can see the whole 6 phases of the beautiful silk cotton tree if you go to Cotterton College between December and May.
Now, interestingly enough, even though each tree produces thousands and thousands, even possibly millions of seeds once it flowers, it's very rare to find young silk cottons underneath the mature tree or even in the surrounding areas, which may lend itself to the belief that the trees were in fact cultivated and have not grown indigenously on the island.
I have been looking around, but to no avail. There are no young silk cotton trees under this well-established one here in the yard of St. Philip's Parish Church. But how did it get here? How did it take root? What are the common beliefs? What are the theories?
It's believed by some, it's been suggested that these silk cotton trees were actually established prior to the building of the churches and to the establishment of the Christian churches at these sites, and they were former Amerindian sacred sites where these churches were built. Now, some people don't follow that. Other people believe that the silk cotton trees would have been planted at the site at a later date after the establishment of the church, but we'll probably never be quite sure. Today, silk cotton tree is not as common in the Barbadian landscape as it would have been quite a few years ago, and that is possibly because during the colonial times, many trees which could be considered sacred were removed. The silk cotton trees have an interesting association with churchyards in Barbados, and it has been found at a number of churches, including St. Philip, where we are, the Codrington College, St. John's Church, among others.
The silk cotton was put to great use in earlier days. You might be surprised to learn that its use prevented many from drowning at sea.
That silk was once very precious, and before modern technology, life jackets were actually stuffed with the silk from the silk cotton tree, and that's primarily due to the water resistant properties of that silk fiber. Now, we've come a long way, and we have plastics, and we have foam, and we have other synthetic material that have since replaced the silk in the life jacket, but it is an amazing historical use of the silk from the silk cotton tree. Now, in addition to that, pillows were also stuffed. If you've ever come and touched the silk from the silk cotton tree, it is so soft, If you rub it against your skin, it's silky, it slides, and it's easy to see why people would have stuffed mattresses or even pillows to sleep at night with the silk from the silk cotton tree. Is it possible that there could be further potential value of the silk? Who knows? I mean, the fibers are quite weak though, so when you try to, if you hold it and you try to pull the silk, it does break very easily, so I'm not sure of its use maybe in the textile industry, but it is an amazing substance, and there possibly, hopefully, will be some commercial value to be found in the silk of the silk cotton tree at some later date.
Do you recall the stories of the Sea Island cotton back in the early 1990s? Well, it is hoped that at least one among us would have the insight and the expertise to develop and commercialize the silk cotton to the benefit of our island, Barbados. Researchers like Carla Daniel have studied the sacred silk cotton tree and have taken note of how it was used in religious ceremonies. In the book The Sacred Silk Cotton Tree by Winston and Kofi Small, we learn of some of the many stories associated with this tree.
He references that the tree trunk, which I'm standing against, would have been used to cast evil spells. The bark was used for tea and other medicinal purposes. The shade of the tree, apparently, which is absolutely massive in this graveyard because it shades approximately, I would say about 60% of the yard is shaded by the silk cotton tree. Apparently that shade attracts spirits, and it also gives a supernatural strength to all spells that are buried within the shade of that tree. Now the roots, which we can see spreading all throughout the yard and among the graves, are actually used to place offerings and to receive the blood of sacrificed animals. The earth around the tree was also used for black magic, and the leaves were used for love spells.
The sacred silk cotton tree is not unique to Barbados. Up and down the island chain, you will find these as prominent features on the island's treescape. And having taken root in some instances centuries ago, there has always been a special reverence attached to these. Like Barbados, there are other stories associated with this tree.
These include Grenada, Trinidad, Tobago, Dominica, and Haiti. And associated with all of these countries are a number of stories that we would probably call today ghost stories. So a number of those darker stories are associated with these trees, and we're going to let you in on a few, just a few of these secrets. Now, in Trinidad and Tobago, there's a legend which goes, well, particularly in Tobago. The legend says that Gang Sarah, who was an African slave, now not only was she a slave, she was also a witch. And she climbed the silk cotton tree in Tobago. And the reason for climbing this tree, now you can just imagine her scaling this tree straight up the sides and all the way to the top. And the reason she was going up this tree was because she planned to fly all the way back to Africa. Now once she reached the very pinnacle of the tree, she paused and she stood and she launched herself off. Unfortunately, she didn't make it all the way back to Africa, but because she had apparently consumed salt, she fell to her death and died. Now the location of that tree in Tobago is actually a tourist attraction today.
This is an interesting point. The spot where Gang Sarah thought she could launch from Tobago all the way back to Africa is today being promoted by the authorities as part of that island's heritage product. And so from the southern Caribbean, we now move in a northwesterly direction towards Jamaica and learn of the Jamaican stories associated with the sacred silk cotton tree.
In Jamaica, it is said that the Spanish who first colonized the island would bury treasure under a silk cotton tree and then kill the slave who buried the treasure so that his spirit would in turn guard the treasure that's hidden under the tree. And that may again have some association with all of these spirits that supposedly inhabit the silk cotton tree. Now, in Jamaican folklore, it is also claimed that the silk cotton tree should not be planted too close to a house because the duppies who will live and inhabit the roots of that tree will throw fire on the inhabitants of the house when they come and go. Now, the old Sharon residents in Barbados who may not be aware of that particular Jamaican folklore actually live literally underneath the silk cotton tree.
From St. Philip, we travelled to the central parish of St. Thomas and visited the site at Old Sharon. There we spoke with resident Julie Aline, who has been living under the shade of this sacred silk cotton tree for more than 70 years. Did Julie have similar experiences of those of our Caribbean neighbours? Well, Miss Aline did not wish to go on camera, but she did speak with us.
When Small said that it was alleged that the Africans used to worship under these trees. But when we come, we never really hear anything about those stories about people worshiping under them or whatever. We used to climb it and sit down on it because it always looked like a tortoise. You understand? Everybody that come and take pictures of it say it looked like a tortoise. But the way how it shaped, right? And they say that you know, it's the biggest tree that they ever see in Barbados, but it has some holes in it, right? That we could have gone in it and sit down. And when we had a lot of cane grounds above here that were bearing canes, you used to get everybody to get their own cane and would got your little hole that you can sit down and suck your canes in it, you know. And the peelings, you know what you do with the peelings. You put them to dry. But it had some holes above there that you could have sit down comfortable and nobody would see you in there or no rain wouldn't fall on you. And some people say you will have to cut it down and cut the rings, hump the rings in it to find out how old it is. But I can't imagine.
And your family was in this area since when probably was? So this where you born?
Yeah, I born here. And my mother, she came here when she was about 2 years.
See?
And my grandmother, she was down here from 1814. Okay. Came along and she saw the tree down here. And, you know, it wasn't, as they say, it wasn't as big as this, you know. But, you know, everybody would come and they would admire it.
Barbados too has its share of superstitious stories surrounding the sacred silk cotton tree. Carla, in her inimitable style, shares some of those stories. Listen very carefully. Let's see if they are all stories Carla read about, or if she is going to share a personal experience.
It's believed that what we would call locally duppies, but also the lugaroo, or the sukuya, or the asema, live in the silk cotton tree during the daytime. So when you're walking around, all of these duppies and spirits are actually hiding or residing within the tree. However, once the sun sets and outside begins to get dark and the shadows start to draw nigh, those spirits will emerge from the tree. Now they come out at night to prey on the unwary.
In the book, Winston and Kofi Small explained how you could protect yourself from the inhabitants of the underworld should you become a victim of their attack.
One has to place lots of grains of sand or rice or any other grain around the house, and then the sukuyant has to count the grains before it can get in, and if you put enough grains, they will stay counting long enough that the sun will rise before they enter and they will be forced to return to the silk cotton tree. Now it's also claimed, remember I mentioned before that the silk from the silk cotton tree is very useful for pillows, primarily because of how soft. Can you imagine having to stuff your pillow with leaves compared to stuffing it with silk? Of course we would just naturally choose the silk of the silk cotton. However, it's claimed in the Leeward Island that while black persons would generally have used the silk for pillows, whites did not do so because of a fear that sleeping on such pillows would bring on hallucinations and cause duppies to ride them. So apparently, stuffing your pillow with silk cotton is the last thing you want to do if you would like to be assured of a good night's sleep. In an interesting variant for this superstition, some people believe to this day that the silk of the silk cotton tree is poisonous and should not be handled. And this isn't a poison that you will be taking in through your skin with handling it, but it seems that this is stemmed from the association between that silk and the spirits.
Now, do you recall the popular Bajan folk song, Millie Gone to Brazil, oh Lord, poor Millie? Well, it is also featured in the book. But many believe that it was not a natural trip, but one associated with the sacred silk cotton tree.
It involved apparently lots of barbed wire and lots of cutting. So Millie, while having been said to have gone to Brazil, was actually the victim of a violent end. And it is believed that the silk cotton tree, which was located in Fitz Village, was actually the site of the last resting place of poor Millie in that song. Some residents of Fitz Village actually confirmed to Winston and Kofi Small that the story was true and that Millie was a real-life person who was rumored to have been murdered close to the nearby silk cotton tree. It was also reported by another girl in Barbados that she had personally witnessed a ball of fire flying out of the air, rolling on the ground, and then burning her young cousin's foot very close to the base of a silk cotton tree. However, when this was investigated, and this took place on a dark night in St. Michael many years ago, there was no traces of the ball of fire, but the scar on her cousin's foot remained to that day.
Well, now because of the many uncertain tales and the mysticism and the superstition associated with the sacred silk cotton tree, many individuals did not want to be associated with this tree. Historian Dr. Carl Watson explains.
In fact, until very recently, it was very difficult to get individuals to cut a silk cotton tree down. And I know in Jamaica and probably in Barbados in years gone by, rituals of libation were done where rum was poured around a tree and a fowl was killed and the blood spilled as an act of sacrifice and an act of repentance for cutting down what was a sacred tree. Also, in the practice of magic or in the practice of obia, this tree was used. Again, if you wanted to harm somebody, you would write their name on a piece of paper, preferably in your blood, and then using a pretty rusty 10-penny nail, you would nail that piece of paper with the individual's name on it, who you wanted to harm, and nail it to the silk cotton tree, and ask the spirits of the silk cotton tree to harm the individual because you wanted your revenge on whatever this individual had done to you or to your family. Today, of course, in a highly educated, more secular society, people hear these things and they sort of dismiss them with a smile. But 100 years ago, these beliefs had real meaning and had an impact on the individuals who believed them. And they say that in magical religious practices, what you believe can have the power to do good or bad. That these deeply held, psychologically rooted beliefs are very important, again, in the way peoples in the past constructed their lives. And it provides a very interesting narrative of past folk beliefs.
Far from being dismissed as belief in superstition, it is clear that the importance of the silk cotton tree has been recorded in the official published history of African slavery in the West Indies. The historians took very seriously the close association the Africans had with this tree and the role it played in their spirituality, resistance to slavery, and social life. And so today, the sacred silk cotton tree as a silent sentinel represents the celebration of culture and an immersive way to provide the rich and creative platform for continuing the tradition of folkloric storytelling. I'm Sherwood McCaskie. As always, I appreciate the fact that you have opted to spend the last 30 minutes with my guest. Until next week at the same time, I'm gone in search of more trees.